Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways we can work together to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today we have with us Professor Matthew Bracey, who has edited a book by Leroy Forlines called Secularism and the American Republic, Revisiting Thomas Jefferson on Church and State. And so, Professor Bracey, we should mention you've got a JD degree, a degree in law, a MDiv degree. You're finishing up your PhD now, I think, at Southern, aren't you?
That's correct.
And so this kind of was right in your wheelhouse, but let's start out by how did you get involved in this project with Mr. Forlines?
Well, after I graduated from law school and Beeson Divinity School, and I got married, I moved back to Nashville, and I started doing I got hired by the college, started doing work around the college, and Mr. Forlines asked me, I think with President Penson's advice, asked me if I wanted to help edit this project. He said that he would be finishing his project soon, and that was 2013, and I think he worked on it pretty much until he passed away.
Yes, so
there was always more
there
to
was
uncover.
Something to add. So I have heard the quest for truth that he would teach class and he would go and add a little bit more to it. And I suspect this was the way. And I also suspect many people who knew Mr. Forlines heard him over the years talk about this. This was something really special to his heart, wasn't it?
It was.
So do you remember, do you know how it first began? How he first got started into looking at secularism and looking at Thomas Jefferson in particular?
One thing I would say in reference to something you just said is that him going back to things over and over and over again showed that he wasn't doing something that was flighty or shallow, but that he was invested and he wanted it to be good, and he wanted to consider it seriously.
Yes.
And consider it from all the angles.
And trying to do it with excellence.
That's right. He wanted to do it with excellence. I believe that the project started because he came across the bit of information that secularism as such did not come around until the 1850s approximately.
Yes.
And he began to think, wait a second, I've been told that some people say that the United States was founded on secularism. How can this be if, in fact, it did not come around until the 1850s?
And you see that in the first part of the book. He talks about when the word was coined and the differences in the words. And so he never could get past, hey, you say we're founded on a secular foundation, and the word wasn't even around back then. He could never get past that, could he?
That's right. That's exactly right.
So then he starts digging and starts looking, and he's looking at some very old books, some very old material. Do you know how that came to be?
Well, in researching when the word and when the movement secularism came to be, he also was looking at the related word secular. Mm-hmm. And so that took him down a path that took him to a lot of those old books and a lot of those old sources. And to be clear, secular and secularism, not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Not
Totally
the same
different.
thing. So the word secular is around.
Yes.
Martin Luther uses the word secular rather positively. It simply means that which is beyond the church, that which is in the world.
Mm-hmm. Not sacred, if you will.
If you will. One type of job refers to the job of a monk or the minister or the person in the church. Another type of job refers to a secular job. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that it's bad. It doesn't mean that it's absent all religious and spiritual qualification. It just means that it's out there in the world. So we're talking about shoemakers. In our day today, we're talking about accountants and lawyers and counselors and just the work people do in the world. It relates to the world.
Very good. And so he looked at that, and then he starts going into these court cases, which I suspect as a lawyer is very interesting. As a non-lawyer, it's kind of interesting. He's looking at dissenting opinions, and he looks at how the court is kind of transforming things that he actually lived through. Tell us a little bit about that walk, what was happening with him along that way.
What's happening with him along this way is there's this interpretation that says America was founded on secularism, and it's embedded within the very framework of our Constitution, within the very framework of the First Amendment. So Mr. Forlines is wondering, well, wait a second, how has this come to be enshrined in our federal constitutional law if, in fact, it wasn't around until the 1850s? And so he goes to the mid-1900s to find the answer to that question. There are two cases, Everson versus Board of Education and McCullum versus Board of Education, which interpreted the First Amendment, namely the separation of church and state, interpreted it through a particular secularist lens that prior to that point people had not interpreted. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court had not interpreted it in that way prior.
And so he's able to lay out some of the thinking. You can see it coming on, can't you, the way some of the justices in particular are thinking, which will lead them to the decisions. And we should point out that one of these decisions, or two of them, are before World War II, before we're involved in World War II at least. So it's a different way of looking at things by looking at the actual opinions, and not just the majority opinion. He also looked at the minority opinions as well. What kinds of things was he finding there?
Well, the reason he's looking at the dissenting opinions is because he's saying, well, first of all, he's wanting to get a full picture of what are these justices thinking? What are they saying? He's wanting to do honor to the text with which he's interacting. He's not trying to play games, so he wants to get a full picture. And what he actually discovers there is, even there at the time in the 1940s, there are justices who are going, hold up, wait a minute, there are problems here. There are problems here with the precedent that's been established. There are philosophical problems. There are constitutional problems. This is not going in the direction it needs to go. Mm-hmm. One justice says, for example, you can't just have a truly secularist separation of church and state in the way that you're wanting it, because culture is inescapably religious. How are you supposed to read Shakespeare? How are you supposed to study Bach? How are you supposed to do any of the stuff involved in education without acknowledging the religious influence? You can't utterly separate that stuff.
And so he's looking at those dissenting opinions, looking at majority opinions, and some of the sources they're using. So share with us a bit about that, which Mr. Forlines could never really get past that, could he? That he would find certain things. What is it? The Rockfish?
The Rockfish Gap Report.
Which, talk about the Rockfish Gap Report, which the justices really missed, didn't they? They didn't talk about that in their opinions. Once he kind of latched onto that, it's like if people just knew this, they would understand.
One of the texts, one of the sources to which people in this discussion frequently go, is a letter that Thomas Jefferson penned as president in the early 1800s. He wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, and he said in that letter that the First Amendment has separated church and state. Mm-hmm. So you have that. Then you jump forward to the 1940s, and you have the justices interpreting that phrase from Jefferson through a secularist lens. And so they say the First Amendment has erected a wall of separation between church and state, and that wall should be high and impregnable, and never shall the twain meet. But what Mr. Forlines says is, I'm not disputing that Thomas Jefferson penned that letter. Of course he penned that letter. But it didn't mean at the time, and it doesn't mean now, what those justices said that it has meant. And the reason for that is because Jefferson's subsequent words and actions run contrary to what the justices in those Supreme Court opinions in the 1940s said that he meant. So in other words, if Jefferson meant what these justices said that he meant, then he later contradicted himself. Mm-hmm. But the more logical way to interpret this is, no, Jefferson was being true to what he was saying. Mm-hmm. So the Rockfish Gap Report, to answer your question, Thomas Jefferson, 18-teens, 1820s, is involved with founding the University of Virginia. And he gives several reports to the board, essentially the Board of Trustees of the school, as they're working toward their grand opening. And one of those reports is the Rockfish Gap Report. And he says in the Rockfish Gap Report something like, proceeding without offense to the Constitution, I hereby recommend that teaching proofs for the existence of God not be in the domain of the professor of divinity, but rather that it would be in the domain of the professor of ethics. Mm-hmm. So there's several very interesting things about that. First of all, state school teaching proofs of the existence of God. Two, you may wonder, well, why does he make this distinction between the prof of divinity and the prof of ethics? The reason for that is because professors of divinity tended to be more sectarian, or what we might call denominational, and he was conceiving of this as a more sort of, shall we say, interdenominational kind of thing. So the professor of ethics would present it in a way that would be less likely to offend various sectarian opinions. He also says in the Rockfish Gap Report that he wants students to learn Greek and Hebrew and Latin, which, the Vulgate is in Latin. There's lots of classical sources in Latin, but when you start talking about Greek and Hebrew, there's not a ton of reasons that you learn those languages except to learn to read the Bible in the original languages. Now, critics of this interpretation will go on and say something like, well, Jefferson never realized those plans, or those plans, some of these plans never came to fruition in the way that he said or hoped that they might. But Mr. Forlines' point is that's irrelevant. What we're looking at is, how did Jefferson understand the relationship of church and state? And he clearly, on the one hand, he doesn't support, shall we say, theocracy. Obviously not. But on the other hand, he doesn't support what today we would call secularism, where there's an utter absence. Rather, he seems to have supported what Mr. Forlines calls accommodation.
Yes.
So not church-state separation, but church-state accommodation. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson himself uses that phrase, church-state accommodation.
Mm-hmm. And so anyone can go online and read the Rockfish Gap Report.
Or they can go right in this book here.
They could go to this book, of course, and you can see it as plain as day. The languages you mentioned, ancient is spelled a little different, I think, but the point is there. And Mr. Forlines was saying, if you wanted to know what Jefferson thought, especially about education, all you have to do is look at the University of Virginia and examples there. Now, he also writes about these letters. Can we use this room for chapel or to have a service? And that really gets to the heart of what Jefferson wanted, doesn't it? The way he dealt with those rooms. So unpack that a bit for us.
There's a section in the book where, so you've got various reports to the board, but you've also got letters that are going back and forth. And so they're talking about whether it's Thomas Jefferson or whomever, the people talking back and forth, are talking about various ways in which rooms at the university can be used. So, if you're a school, you use rooms for all kinds of purposes. You may have, it may be for internal purposes, it may be for external purposes, but the point is that rooms get a lot of usage. And in this case, like you mentioned, one of the ideas that they have is some of these rooms can be used for chapels, for different groups, different denominational groups to use there at the school, which again is a state university accommodating specific religious groups. It's not the disposition we get today where it's just utter separation.
So this from working in a college and people using rooms. You think this is not a big deal, people asking back and forth to use them, but what Mr. Forlines is unpacking here is, it shows you Jefferson and also Madison's philosophy about the way a state university should be used, doesn't it?
That's absolutely right. And in effect, what Mr. Forlines is saying is the legal enshrinement of secularism through these court cases from the mid-1900s, they just got Jefferson wrong.
Yeah,
they just got Jefferson wrong.
So how do you hope the book will be used for the various people who get to read it from time to time?
Several ways, and I also want to speak to the ways in which I hope and the ways in which Mr. Forlines hopes. Mr. Forlines' hope was that this book would inspire and effect a sea change.
Mm-hmm.
His ambitions were quite large, quite big, and
Overturning of a Supreme Court
overturning
case.
of badly decided decisions. That's right. And when he started this project, even a decade ago, 2 decades ago, there were people who wondered perhaps if his ambition exceeded, his hopes exceeded what could realistically happen. Who's to say what can happen? I mean, who would have said once upon a time that Roe v. Wade, KCV, Planned Parenthood would be overturned by Dobbs?
Right.
So it's a very interesting day in which we live, but maybe not so elevated as that. Mr. Forlines is interested in people knowing truth.
Yes.
Truth matters because it's truth, and as Christians, as we seek to interact in the public square, it's important that we know what the founders of our country intended.
Mm-hmm.
We may have our theological reasons and our biblical reasons for practicing religious liberty and for sharing the gospel and being salt and light to the earth. But Mr. Forlines would say there's good historical and legal and constitutional reasons to do so as well.
And I suspect a lot of what he shares people are really unaware of. The way he lays it out in a very simple way. And so you look at this book and there's very good information. I know you're trying to honor Mr. Forlines with this book as well. What does this book show us about Mr. Forlines?
This book shows us about Mr. Forlines that he was what he preached and what he taught. So he taught, for example, that we are total personalities and that we should care not simply for these little pockets of areas, but that a sovereign God and the people of a sovereign God, in fact, should be concerned with all of life. So he writes a commentary on Romans. He writes a biblical ethics book. He writes books on systematic theology. So you got biblical theology, systematic theology, you got ethical theology. And then he turns around and is writing stuff on history and
Law.
And the state of our nation
Yeah.
and law and all of that. So he was a holistic person, and he sought to integrate what our theology and what our beliefs have to do with the world and politics. And for some people, they would rather perhaps not think too much about politics, or it's too controversial. Theology is safe, but Mr. Forlines says, essentially by his life, there's a relationship here. There are implications here. We need to have courage to go after things, even if some people may find them difficult or find them hard.
That's good.
Or inconvenient.
Yes. I think we can learn from, like, the way he's studying. I notice he's using a lot of old books. I notice he's using a lot of direct sources, not this person said this. He's going and he's reading the cases. If you look at the notes you have back here, look at the appendix. You alluded to that earlier. Some good stuff in that appendix. So I think it's good for all of us to have that kind of curiosity. And I tried to figure out, how did he come to this? Well, he must have read something, and then that led to him reading something else, which led to him reading something else. And whereas some people would be, watching television or doing what else with their time, he's over there in his office reading and writing. And it really does tell us how to keep a mind active and honor the Lord with our mind.
And he's talking about it with whoever will talk to him and whoever will listen. I mean, lots of people through the years heard the name George Jacob Holyoke.
Yes.
And secularism and all this kind of stuff. You said something that triggered this. There's a point in this book. So he's reading a source of a source. And he noticed that there are ellipses in the source he's reading of the source. So it's a collection book. And he wonders, what's in that ellipses that's missing? And so the interpreter he's reading says Jefferson believed such, and here's the proof. But then he gives a quote from Jefferson, and there are those ellipses. And Mr. Forlines says, but that's the opposite interpretation of what I'm seeing. Mm-hmm. This is a very curious thing. So what does Mr. Forlines do? you're talking about his methodology, he goes back to find the original source that guy quoted from, and he realizes the ellipses literally change the interpretation. Like by putting the ellipses in there, it seems that Jefferson's saying one thing, but when you take the ellipses out and when you look at it in the whole context, it actually turns it around completely. And he doesn't want to call the guy who's interpreting Jefferson dishonest because he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know his heart. But he does wonder. I mean, talking about sources, talking about methodology,
Yes.
talking about being thorough and careful. One of the things Mr. Forlines models to us in our day and age of just reading headlines and taking people at their word, he demonstrates care.
Absolutely.
Being care with what we see. And sometimes it's not even enough. So you can read an article and somebody quotes something, but then you have to wonder, well, are they quoting the thing rightly?
Yeah.
Are they manipulating the information in some way? So he demonstrates care.
To always kind of go back to the original source. When you hear or read something in a newspaper or on TV, look at what the research actually says. One last thing, I think, his drive. You just mentioned it. If he talked to you, he talked about secularism. He talked about Thomas Jefferson. I called him once. I was doing the Forlines lectures. I was, where Tippett's Chapel is. I drove from Tippett's Chapel to North Carolina Central University. He talked the entire time about this subject. And he had that kind of interest. He had that, and there's just something to that, having curiosity. And I'm so thankful that you have seen it to fruition where this is now in print and everyone can get some of those lessons we all got privately from time to time from Mr. Forlines. So thank you for sharing this with us, Professor Bracey.
You're very welcome. I'm thinking about conversations with Mr. Forlines. Sometimes you'd be talking about one thing and he wanted to bring that conversation back to secularism. Let me say, people might think that a book about history and law and legal analysis is going to be dry, boring, hard stuff. But as you said, he really does present it in a way that's easy to understand by the person, even the person not otherwise acquainted with this subject area.
Absolutely.
And I also have to mention, Ms. Fay specifically asked me to mention the recommendations on the back, the endorsements, I mean to say. So you've got former governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, who has endorsed the book. You have my previous PhD supervisor. Before he retired, he was my supervisor, Mark Coppinger, who was president of a Southern Baptist seminary. And then later he worked as a professor at SBTS. You have Wilford McClay, who was at the University of Oklahoma. I think he's at Hillsdale now. Of course, Dr. Pickerilly, President Pinson. Down below you have Dr. Sheldon, who actually authored the Johns Hopkins University Press book on Thomas Jefferson. And Sheldon, was a professor at the University of Virginia, which is very fitting because that's the university that Thomas Jefferson founded. So I do want to mention this isn't just some interesting interest of a man in the last decade or two. It's not merely a unique interest of a man in the last decade or two of his life that nobody else is really taking seriously. People are and have taken it quite seriously. People in the Christian Academy and the non-Christian Academy, people like Mike Huckabee.
Yeah. So
I think that speaks to the quality of the work here. And I'll also say that this is not the totality of what he worked on. This is just one part of what he worked on.
2 more volumes, right?
And that's to be determined. There will at least be another book to come from the research that he did. But we didn't want to publish a book that was 1,000 pages.
Right.
So we there's going to be several books that come out of the research that he did.
That's great. Well, we appreciate you all doing it, and we hope our readers will get it. It's if you've read Quest for Truth, you've read some of Mr. Forline's work, it's the same kind of way, except more in a history, almost law way. And it's hard to put down. I think I got it last week. And so it's the kind of thing that you start reading, you're like, oh, this is pretty interesting, and what did happen in this letter, and so forth. So it's good stuff. So we appreciate you taking the time to invest in this, and we so appreciate Mr. Forlines and his dedication to this project.
Well, thank you for having me on and asking these questions, and I hope that people will get the book. And it's good not just for people, for you, for people listening and buying it for themselves. It also makes a great, if I do say so, makes for a great birthday gift.
Yes.
For someone in your family.
Maybe even anniversary gift.
Anniversary gift.
That may be stretching it.
Depending on when this airs, a Christmas gift.
Yes.
Stocking stuffers.
It's all good. It's really good. And to get it, they could go to Amazon.com. They could also go to Welch.edu as well to purchase the book, right?
The Welch, WelchPress.com. Anyway, the Welch College Press website. You can Google it or DuckDuckGo it.
And you'll be able to track it down.
That's right.
Well, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we want to thank our listeners. If you know someone that would benefit from this podcast, please take it, share it with them. Remember, every little bit counts, that we truly are better when we work together to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you.